All right, good evening, everyone. Welcome back to Class 3 of People's Planning Academy. The heat is on, and so hopefully it does warm up a little bit. It's perfect. All right, so tonight we're going to talk about how planning can make our city and our neighborhoods more resilient. But first, I'm going to go back to some of the survey questions. Thank you for those of you who followed up with us on the survey. There's a couple questions I want to go through. And so someone asked about how the percentage of parkland in Indianapolis compares to some other places. And so I pulled, this is from that same website that Andre Denman showed us, the Trust for Public Land Park Score. And so you can see us at the bottom, we've got about 5%. And then I list some peer cities above us, and then some major US cities just for reference. And so you can see that we do struggle with parkland, so that's a huge need for us. There was someone that made a comment that a lot of our focus has been on the physical places of Indianapolis and Marion County and kind of where are the people in all of this. And so this academy is focused on the land use plan, which is a plan for the physical development of the city, but we are trying to pick topics to explain how that physical city impacts the people. So tonight when we talk about resiliency, it's absolutely true that in some neighborhoods, it's the people. In fact, it's many neighborhoods. It's the people that we rely on to help each other out. And so from a planning standpoint, we need to make sure that we are building places that allow people to build those relationships so they can come together when it's not an emergency, so they can rely on each other when there is one. We need to think about things like, do we have community facilities in neighborhoods distributed across the county? And so if we have an ice storm or a polar vortex again, if you were here a few years ago, we had warming centers set up across town, or in the summer, sometimes when it gets really hot, we have cooling centers set up. And so think about how the physical layout of neighborhoods and the physical places we have support the needs of the people. And I hope that that's what we're conveying through many of these sessions. Someone asked that the purpose of the academy, the current academy, is clear, but what happens after the plan is complete? And that's a fantastic question that we'll probably be putting out to you at the end. I will say that as long as I'm around, this is something I'm really passionate about, public education. My previous life at Ball State was public education. And so this is something I would really like to keep going. Maybe not as formal, structured, 6 classes and graduate sort of thing, but maybe quarterly or once a year we all come together and talk about a different topic or two. So it is something that I hope to keep going as long as I'm around. And also know, if you don't know about the Indianapolis Neighborhood Resource Center offerings, they offer a lot of the community building courses about how you organize neighborhoods and get input and things like that. And so INRC is also a great way if you're not familiar with their classes. And then someone asked, what does healthy housing development look like in an urban area? What's the density of that? I don't know. There is no magic answer to that. If you Google Goldilocks density, you'll find an article from The Guardian that talks about this magical density where it's not too much, where it's inhumane, and we've got lots of towers everywhere, but it's also not too little where we really can't support neighborhood services or vibrant life. So quoting from that article, dense enough to support vibrant main streets with retail and services for local needs, but not too high that people can't take the stairs up in a pinch. Dense enough to support bike and transit infrastructure, but not so dense to need subways and huge underground parking garages. Dense enough to build a sense of community, but not so dense as to have everyone slip into anonymity. And so, random question, what do you think the densest city in America is? Anyone have a guess? So LA, I heard New York, LA, any other ideas? San Francisco? Anyone else? Atlanta? Seattle. So it's Los Angeles. You would not think that. Los Angeles is the densest city in America. It's the 90th densest city in the world. And so it's got about 1,000 people per square mile in LA. Any idea how many people per square mile Indianapolis has? 1,400? 14 people or 1,400? So we have about 328 people per square mile. That puts us as the 188th densest city in the world. So just for reference, Columbus, Ohio, one of our sister cities that we compare ourselves a lot to, their number of 152, they've got 425 people per square mile. So a lot of planners look at Paris as kind of an ideal density. If you've been to Paris, I've never been to Paris, but if you've been to Paris, there's a very vibrant street life. The architecture is beautiful. They don't have towers. They have 4 or 5 or 6, sometimes 7 or 8 story buildings, and it's extremely dense. Paris is 1,370 people per square mile. And so you do not need towers to build density. It's kind of a lesson. We've learned our lesson. If you were in Chicago, a couple of decades ago, and you go down the highway and you see these row after row of public housing towers, we have learned that that type of density is extremely harmful, not only to the city, but to the people who live in it from a psychological and public safety perspective. And so density does not necessarily mean tall buildings. You can get beautiful walkable density with much smaller buildings. And that is kind of the extent of the questions. So previously on People's Planning Academy, session 1, we learned the difference between planning and zoning. Last session on health, we learned about active living from Kim Irwin. So the fact that you spend most of your life near your house, so obviously that built environment around you impacts your health outcomes honestly more than your genetics. So your zip code means more than your genetic code. If you read through the workbook, we talked some about social capital and the importance about how we build neighborhoods so that people can connect. And we'll have a speaker tonight that talks about the resiliency aspects of that. And then we also mentioned, and in the workbook, is the environmental burden. And so the fact that a lot of our pollution comes from the transportation industry, and that burden is not distributed evenly across Marion County, either our places or our people. So before I move on to tonight's session, are there any questions you have for me? All right, seeing none. Tonight's agenda, we're going to talk about environmental resiliency. Allyson Mitchell from Prosperity, Indiana will be our guest. Then we'll move on to economic resiliency. Mark O'Neill from Green Street Limited will be our speaker. And then finally, we'll wrap up with social resiliency with Matt Wakefield from Keep Indianapolis Beautiful. And so with that, Allyson Mitchell, who is the Director of Sustainability for Prosperity, Indiana.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be a part of this effort. So today, I'm going to give you just an overview of what we're going to talk about here, do a quick introduction, tell you a little bit about Prosperity, Indiana, explain the difference between sustainability and resilience, talk about climate change impacts in Indiana, run through kind of the process for climate resilience planning, and then we'll talk about what the opportunities are inherent in a changing climate. So, as Brad mentioned, my name is Allyson Mitchell, and I'm the Director of Sustainability for Prosperity, Indiana. My background is, formerly I owned my own sustainability consulting company here in Indianapolis. At the same time, was teaching a sustainability rating system assessment course at IUPUI-SPIA. And prior to those positions, I worked in the city of Indianapolis in the Office of Sustainability as a project manager when that office got started about 8 years ago. And then I also have experience working as a sustainability professional in the commercial real estate development industry and in landscape architecture. My educational background is in landscape architecture, law, and horticulture, so kind of an interesting mix of professions, but led me to pursue a career in sustainability. So Prosperity, Indiana is a statewide nonprofit based here in Indianapolis. We were formerly known as the Indiana Association for Community Economic Development, IACED, quite a mouthful. We rebranded last fall, and now we are Prosperity, Indiana. On staff, we have an executive team, a policy director, myself as the sustainability director, a planning director, a training director, a membership manager, and then some administrative staff as well. I mentioned that we're a statewide organization. We're membership based, and we, within our membership, Primarily, we have community development corporations, or CDCs, local units of government, developers of affordable housing, human services providers, and then environmental organizations as well. And we take a asset-based approach to community economic development, so where sometimes your local economic development organization or LEDO will be focused on attracting employers to their community for jobs. We look kind of broader than just attracting employers. So we serve our members in kind of 4 categories, how we like to describe it. Advocacy, we work at the state and national level to represent the interests of our members when it comes to policy. We help with connecting and building coalitions, so bringing our members into groups, focused, we do all kinds of events and opportunities for our members to meet like-minded individuals within their particular field across the state that they may not get to connect with on a variety of topics. We help with capacity building, so we do trainings, and we do some fee-for-service consulting work as well to help our members on a variety of topics. And then we also provide funding in a variety of ways for our members. So now I'm going to dive right in and start talking about the concept of sustainability and how it differs from resilience. If you are at all familiar with sustainability, you may have heard of the definition that came from the 1987 Brundtland Commission report, which is really sustainable development, and that being a development that meets the needs of the future without compromising meets the needs of the present without compromising the needs of future generations. And that's a good description for sustainable development, but in the world of sustainability that's in that field, flaws have sort of emerged from that definition. It's a little bit too limiting. People saw the word development in that definition as meaning economic growth, and maybe economic growth is not really what's necessary or best all the time in all cases. So that was problematic. Also, the difference between when looking at it kind of on a global perspective, because climate change is a global problem, who's to blame? Who should bear the burdens? Developed countries, countries that are developing, that created a lot of troubling concerns that would arise in these conversations, especially on the global scale. And then, as you may have heard, the 3 pillars of sustainability, economic, social, and environmental, and are those independent components, or are those interdependent systems? And you may have seen this diagram at some point in the past, and the conversation kind of stagnated a little bit about how do we really think about comprehensive sustainability, and as we're facing a changing climate, how does this model really work for the industry, for the movement? So sustainability is actually more aptly defined, and I kind of think about financial sustainability, this definition kind of applies, is the ability to continue a defined behavior indefinitely. And when it comes to climate change, when you've got a changing climate, being able to continue a defined behavior indefinitely is really not the goal. You've got to be agile, you've got to be able to respond to the changes. So this business as usual, but trying to balance these interests was really just falling short. So, and this was really because the forces of climate change were being felt in every corner of the globe. So that disproportionate impact falling on vulnerable communities was really bringing the flaws in sustainability more prevalent. So the term resilience started to emerge as really a better way to describe the goals that we're seeking in a changing climate. So, but how do we define resilience? And it gets defined in a lot of different contexts. When it comes to physical objects, the ability of a substance or an object to spring back into shape or have elasticity. Okay, that's helpful maybe. The amount of potential energy stored in an elastic material when deformed. No, not really, that doesn't get us anywhere. In the field of psychology, resilience is defined as a process of adapting well in the face of adversity, trauma, tragedy, threats, or significant sources of stress. It means bouncing back from difficult experiences. This is starting to get closer to what the movement had in mind. And then ecology defines resilience as the ability of an ecosystem to return to its original state after being disturbed. So there's kind of a blending of definitions here going on when we think about using the term resilience and blending that with in the context of climate change to get to the term climate resilience. So climate resilience is defined as the capacity for a socio-ecological system to absorb the stresses and maintain function in the face of external stresses imposed upon it by climate change, and to adapt, reorganize, and evolve into more desirable configurations that improve the sustainability of the system, leaving it better prepared for future climate change impacts. This really gets at the comprehensive approach that climate resilience is seeking to pursue. Not just kind of continuing business as usual, but really being adaptive and being responsive. And the other way I try to define this to people, and this is a little bit of my lawyer hat coming on, but it's basically risk mitigation and risk management applied to climate change, but going further to capture the opportunities and benefits in the process. And the other good thing about this way of defining the movement is that there's no blame or shame in this definition. We're not talking about where climate change comes from, who should bear the burden or who should be blamed for it. That's really not the point. The point is that we as a society decide that we're going to plan to be resilient in the face of the changes. Okay, so great, now we have this kind of new term to help us really more comprehensively define how we want to talk about the issue. What was that issue again? Climate change. Okay, so what does that really even mean? What is climate change? So climate change is, the climate is changing, big deal. Why do we in Indiana need to worry about climate change? I mean, rising sea level is not really going to impact us. We're landlocked Indiana, right? So you may have seen some similar models that talk about sea temperature change over time. This one is about climate change impacts and observed and projected temperature change in Indiana. And you'll see they've looked at this, combines both historical data that's been recorded and what's projected to happen in the future based on a couple of different models, kind of the worst case scenario and the best case scenario. And I think that it's pretty clear that even in the best case scenario on this chart, we're in for some significant temperature change in Indiana. So here's some more facts about climate change impacts in the state of Indiana. Since the beginning of the 20th century, temperatures in Indiana have risen approximately 1 degree Fahrenheit. Indiana has experienced an increase in the number of heavy precipitation events, even under the higher emissions pathway, so kind of that worst case scenario on the chart that I just showed you. Historically unprecedented warming is projected by the end of the 21st century. It's kind of scary to hear those words. Precipitation is projected to increase in Indiana, with increases most likely during the winter and spring, and the intensity of future droughts is projected to increase. So we'll have hotter, drier summers, warmer, wetter winters, and this could lead to loss of organic soil material. That might matter for an agricultural state like Indiana. And then additionally, when we do have a drier winter, the soils will be more vulnerable for an impact of multi-year droughts. So a bad situation could get worse more quickly because of the rising temperatures in Indiana. So we're lucky to have some institutions in the state of Indiana that are studying this, Purdue being one of them. The Indiana Climate Change Impacts Assessment will provide accessible, credible climate science to Hoosiers, allowing us to better understand climate-related risks and build more effective plans for a more productive future. So the good news is there's the folks at Purdue are kind of dealing with the science and explaining what has happened, what is projected to happen, and that gives the planners of the world and folks like you a better sense of what we need to do now to adapt to these changes that are coming our way. Purdue is getting ready to roll out their updated report, and it will be available in late 2017. And I've talked to Jeff Dukes from Purdue. It's very sciencey, of course, but they'll be making it very accessible for everyday people to understand what this really means. So with these impacts that we see here, what can we do to address these changes and to minimize the negative impacts of climate change in Indiana? Well, one thing we can do is start the climate resilience planning process. And in this process, as opposed to just balancing priorities when we thought about sustainability, we're going to look at minimizing risk, and we're also going to try to capture benefits in this process. This process should be aspirational, opportunistic, process-based, results-oriented, actionable, measurable, but most of all, achievable. So how do we go about defining precisely what we want as a community when we think about how we're going to respond to this changing climate? And how do we build or use tools to get us there? And the answer is it's a process. So we think about, this is kind of a really short basic list of things that we want: clean air, clean water, local food. I think these are things everybody can kind of agree on. Active transportation, stable housing, good education, secure jobs, recreation and culture, and then obviously a really resilient plan for disaster recovery. And then the tools that we need to get there in this process are informed and engaged citizens, that's all of you, transparency in the process, equity, so we make sure that we have representation from a broad set of stakeholders, and also that the outcomes are equitable, effective planning, so thinking about not only the long-range planning, but also how do we respond when a disaster hits. And then effective policy at the local, state, and national level. So when we think about the process of climate resilience planning, there are basically 5 steps. The first thing you want to do is determine what really are the values of your community. Every group that works on climate resilience planning probably has, some will have 5 steps, some will have 4, some will have 3. So it'll shift a little depending on who you talk to. This is sort of meant to kind of capture the broadest sense of what climate resilience planning is about. The next step after determining your shared community values is inventorying what are the systems that support resilience in your community, deciding on the strategies and goals to implement those solutions, defining the outcomes that you want in the process of building resilience, and then, and this is kind of an ongoing one throughout the process, but measuring your results. You're reassessing your approach, thinking about your setbacks, and then celebrating your successes. So we'll dive into each one of these steps just a little bit more detail. The first one, like I said, was determine what the shared community values. So the first thing we need to think about when we are going to start this conversation about climate resilience planning is who's in the room and who is not in the room that needs to be. Are the people that are engaged in the process representative of the community from the entire spectrum? And then that's kind of the starting point. Then you think about which values are present in your community, and then further define and prioritize them. And this will vary from community to community. And this is also a great way to sort of build local support through the process, because when you've got a diverse set of stakeholders getting together to think about the values of the community, it's a really great way for people to build consensus about who they are and what they want as a community. So some examples of what some of these shared community values are: things like equity, justice, economic stability, cultural integrity, collective responsibility, self-determination, mutual respect, local autonomy, intergenerational engagement, a healthy environment, and then meaningful civic participation, et cetera, et cetera. Every community will sort of rank these differently, and it's an important part of the process sort of not to be missed. The second step in the process is to inventory the systems that support resilience in your community. So you got to think through all the different systems and what are the strengths, the weaknesses, and the opportunities that you see. So these are everything from food systems to social and governance systems, natural systems, how energy is produced, transported, consumed, in all systems, public health and safety, local economy, the built environment. I know you were talking, we had Kim Irwin in last session to talk about the built environment's impact on health and well-being. That's a perfect example of sort of defining what's working, what's not working in your built environment when it comes to public health. Resource and waste management systems, and this is, I know you're probably thinking your cart on the curb, and it's really beyond that. It's more than just the solid waste and recycling programs, but everything from how are cars disposed of, and how are homes, when they're torn down, how are those dealt with, and how are they how's the waste from those managed. And then transportation system as another system. So really kind of thinking about, kind of stepping back and looking at the system overall. Next, you want to think about strategies to create goals and implement solutions. So what strategies has your community used in the past that brought about desired results? What strategies could your community invest in strengthening to bring about desired results in this effort? For example, you may have had an experience in your community where faith leaders got together and led a leadership development strategy to develop mentors aiming at addressing youth truancy, and it was effective in reducing absenteeism into local high schools. You want to think about breaking down the components of something that worked in your community and think about why it worked, who was involved, and how was it able to be effective in your community, and then pick that apart and see what can be gleaned from those experiences that you can apply in the climate resilience planning process. The next step is defining outcomes of planning for resilience. So these are kind of the things that you think about when you think about climate resilience, the kind of fun part. And some of these were mentioned earlier, but you want to think about, what things do you want to prioritize in your community? Is it really going to be focused on transportation system, active transportation? Are you going to put, a lot of weight on local resident retention and talent attraction? Is your community losing jobs? So this will kind of vary depending on what your community has, what its background is and what it's currently experiencing. But I think informed and engaged citizens is one of those things it's kind of a process-oriented thing, and I think that's probably needs to be towards the top of priorities for about every community going through this process in order to do this process well. And then the last one is to measure progress, think about approach, and consider the setbacks and celebrate success. So I mentioned earlier, transparency is really critical to build credibility in the process and keep citizens engaged. And there's really no done in this process, it's just cyclic. You'll constantly be reevaluating your progress, reevaluating your goals, thinking through, how it's impacting the most vulnerable populations, what external factors are helping or hindering, things that you didn't see coming, and how your community responded to those things. And it's always good to recognize positive leadership regularly. That really kind of keeps the wheels rolling. So back to these impacts of climate change in Indiana. Avoiding all these bad things is obviously worthwhile, right? We want to be able to deal with drought. We want to be able to deal with disease-borne illnesses. But what about capturing the good? Is this all doom and gloom? No. The good news is there are plenty of opportunities that Indiana will have as a result of climate change. So when it comes to energy, we have an enormous potential for renewable energy in the state of Indiana, and we, along with the technology of battery storage that's coming very rapidly, we have an opportunity to transform our energy system, thinking through how we produce, distribute, and use energy is a very, very big change that is coming, and Indiana is going to have to make a decision for how we're going to deal with climate. Food production, we're going to have extended growing season, so what are we going to do with that? Should we diversify crops so that we have more local consumption? We're not having to rely on California to provide us with our food. Excuse me. Transportation. Obviously, the shift in energy supply is going to have an impact on the transportation system, and also, higher priority on active transportation provides an opportunity for us to rethink how we approach transportation. And then employment. All of these changes are going to create opportunities for new jobs, new companies. Protecting natural resources will have an impact on tourism and recreation, and obviously will help us with ecosystem services. Local economies will have an opportunity to be reinvigorated through these changes to the food, waste, energy, and transportation systems. And then in the process of doing this and localizing the economy, you have an opportunity to have more local social connections, which just makes your community more resilient. So here are some additional tools and resources if you're interested in learning more about climate resilience planning. And that's my presentation. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Allyson. And so Allyson talked a lot about different systems, and so transportation and food and all of those things. So think about in your neighborhood, are there places where your neighbors are vulnerable? So if you were here a few years ago, we had the polar vortex that January, and we couldn't plow our streets. If you remember that, we had potholes in our ice, which was pretty amazing. But Indigo shut down for 2 days, right? Just because of that one storm. So if your neighborhood or your residents, neighbors, whatever, are dependent on Indigo to get to work, what happened? Well, they couldn't, right? Simply because we couldn't keep the streets plowed. And the projections show that we're going to have more and more of that. And so that's just one manifestation of how climate changes can impact neighborhoods. And so next I'm going to introduce Mark O'Neill, who is a senior associate with Green Street Unlimited, who is going to talk about economic resilience. Mark.
Good evening, everyone. As Brad said, my name is Mark O'Neill. I'm with Green Street. We are a Indianapolis-based real estate and planning consultancy, and we've been thinking about land use and transportation for quite a while, and have degrees in urban planning and urban design. And in my day job, we work on market analysis, helping cities think about how best to use their land from a market perspective. We also work a lot with what we call anchor institutions, so it's universities and hospitals and museums all around the state and the Midwest. So if you don't mind, just by a show of hands, how many of you, before this series of workshops, have been involved with Plan 2020 or a planning exercise like this before? A few of you, okay, great. And also I'm curious, how many of you are here for a pretty specific concern or even an opportunity in your neighborhood, whether it may be blighted property, proposed development? Okay. Good to know. So I'll start real quick just with a definition. Allyson did a nice job of this. Resilience meaning just the ability to recover from misfortune or change. Keeping in mind that can be quick. We've seen some flooding in the news recently. This could be the closing of a factory or something that comes on pretty suddenly, but it can also be slow. An example is Indy, Indiana's aging population has about trebled over the last 100 years, and that also means we have a smaller share of the population that's working age as well. And then, of course, thinking of the economy as the wealth and resources of a region, especially in the terms of production and consumption of goods and services. So economic resilience means something like the ability to recover from and adjust to negative impacts of economic shocks. Here's another question. How many of you would currently rate Indianapolis as economically resilient? Great. The other fan with me of Indianapolis, I think we're going to make it, but there's certainly plenty of work on it. We're going to talk about that. So bringing it down to earth here, this means making sure the people who need them have jobs, have safe and comfortable homes, access to goods and services, and health. But in terms of land use, this connects to the transportation systems, and as Brad mentioned, if winter storm knocks out Indigo, are there other ways for people to get to these really important things in hard times? Anything else anyone can think of that maybe is not on this short list for resiliency? Infrastructure, just on my way here, I thought might be added to this list. So here's an interesting fact. From 1990 to 2010, America saw quite a significant decline in manufacturing jobs. But Indianapolis took a smaller hit, especially compared to some of our Midwestern peers. But that's not to belittle the fact that we still lost, about 1 in 4 manufacturing jobs. So this is a perfect example, right, of a pretty sudden shock, of course, for families if this is the closing of a factory that we have to deal with. So in terms of workforce development, this can mean are the skills that you had working in a particular factory transferable to another job, and is that job even there? And then if not, do you have resources nearby that can help you then switch into another position? I mean, educational resources have to be within reach, and transportation and money and other hurdles like that can keep folks from being able to switch. If a carrier plant or a Rexnord plant closes down, we have to be able to adjust. Another interesting fact, compared to a few of our peers, in that same time period, we have, I would say, been pretty resilient in some other services. So business and professional services, but also what we call eds and meds. So we've seen more growth than some of our peers, including ones like Baltimore, Philly, and Pittsburgh that are known for their eds and meds. They're great university and health systems. Well, we have those too. So building off of our strengths is really important for resilience in terms of a job, but this can also count for the business side of things too. If support services around the manufacturing sector may also have to adjust to figure out how they can come up with a different client base, or just change their trajectory as well on the business side of things. Demographics. So in my job, we do our best to project what will happen in the near future and how cities can adjust. I wish we had a crystal ball, but we do not. So we like to say that demographics are destiny. And in terms of land use, housing and residential uses are, of course, a major component of what we build here in the city. And much of what we built was built in decades past, and much of what we built reflected household characteristics of the time. And only a generation ago, you can see that they were drastically different. There's a plummeting 5-person household line there in gray, where towards the end of the baby boom there in the early 60s, 5-person households significantly outnumbered both 3 and 4-person households. But with the end of the baby boom and Gen X, that certainly changed, and then highlighted in the brighter white 1 and 2-person households continue to climb. This is a national statistic, but this is certainly also reflected here in Indy. And it's easy to see in the near future how, those 1 and 2-person household growth will continue. How many of you, by the way, are living in a 1 or 2-person household, either by yourself or with a partner? Okay, now how many of you, either this could be you or someone you know, is a singleton and they're in a house that's probably a little too big for them or a little bit hard to keep up? Well, that's hard to change really quickly. The existing housing stock we have is largely what we have. You can make additions or remodel, but adjusting to these demographics is more easily done with new construction. So we've seen in downtown particularly lots of apartments built, especially smaller apartments. I would say that the influx of those newer housing formats isn't to say that that's going to eventually replace all the houses we have, but hopefully that can start to adjust the mix of housing options we have. A diverse set of housing options is something that we always promote because not only with the size of households, but ethnic makeup and the age of households and incomes can also fluctuate. And so having a diverse mix of housing units, whether that's homes or apartments or condos, lets you weather those ups and downs of a baby boom, or my generation, the echo baby boom, the millennials, so that every community has something to offer for a young person or an old person, whether or not they're working or not. When there's a generally uniform mix of housing options, you become that much more susceptible to shock. So, of course, in the recent mortgage crisis that led to a recession about 10 years ago, we saw that the communities around America that had invested in a pretty uniform new housing stock suffered the most because it was an undifferentiated set of options that had been overbuilt. A few years ago, the Metropolitan Planning Organization and my board, the Metro Indy Board of Realtors, conducted a really interesting survey that I use a lot in my work, where a few thousand residents in central Indiana were asked about what they like to see in a home, in a neighborhood when they're shopping around. And gray and white there, you can see paired up who answered rural for where they live now versus their ideal location. Small town, suburban housing only situation, or suburban mix of business and housing situation, urban residential or downtown city. The first group that I find fascinating is the two where currently there are far more people living in really only residential neighborhoods, be that a suburban or an urban context where it's just mostly houses around and you can't walk to many neighborhood or business services. So that's over 60% of Marion County residents, compared to maybe only 30% who would prefer to live in just a housing-only type neighborhood. And then the other group is in short supply. So some folks one day wish to move out into the countryside, but then these next three, I would argue, would match a pattern that you've seen around town and around central Indiana, that a lot of folks like a small town, kind of Main Street feel, where it'd be a lower density, but certainly a mix of uses in a small Main Street. And then the suburbs of Indianapolis are doing this well and kind of urbanizing, you might say, or building more mixed-use development patterns in their downtowns. And then certainly downtown Indianapolis, where we are now, is in short supply, and you see that in rent prices and home prices and things like that. this matters, this imbalance in particular, where there are fewer options for people, that drives up prices for homes. And that matters because then you have less to spend on food, or you have less to spend on your healthcare bills, or you have less to spend on transportation. And quickly, for many folks in Indianapolis, these burdens can really pile up. If the loss of a job can kind of be enough to cause a housing situation and transportation adversity to really pile up on a family. So from these preference surveys, we generally try and promote a mix of housing types, and certainly in a walkable setting, so that if you can't afford a car, if your car breaks down, or if you want to spend that money elsewhere, there are other ways of getting around. Interestingly, economic development strategies have shifted in the last 10 or 20 years, where it used to be what we would call smokestack chasing, where you try and pursue the next factory that 20 years ago and beyond would have provided a decent working middle-class wage even, and so you just try to woo them with free land or some other public incentive. And then also you might brag about the good workers you have. And so those two, supporting businesses and workers, are still really important. We do it a little bit in a little bit different way, supporting business and workers, but in a mutually beneficial way. We also pay a lot more attention now to quality of life. That means a lot of things to different people, but everything from education and good health options in your neighborhood to just a reasonable working wages, great public space and parks and things like that. And indeed, if you've read the news recently, Amazon, a large online retailer, has announced they're going to build a second headquarters somewhere. And I was skimming through the RFP that they sent out to all big cities, and I would say all cities, small and large, it seems, are pursuing the second headquarters of Amazon, where they may eventually hire 50,000 people, I think making over $100,000. And there it is. They're looking for an overall high quality of life where they go. They're not just looking for cheap land or educated labor, which is all important, but the private sector in Amazon's case, but then also the nonprofit sector is also paying a lot more attention to quality of life. Firms like Amazon are really in tough competition, in their case, for software developers and salespeople and things like that. And to attract those, they are looking for quality of life just the same way that we are as residents. That's all I have. Don't want to keep you from the beautiful weather, but I am happy to answer any questions.
You showed that slide about we just talked about how having one kind of housing is not really the way to go.
Right.
But like we had a huge housing boom in the 90s and early 2000s before the crash. Like there were cornfields turned into subdivisions all over the place.
Right.
Like what happened to those? And as the economy gets better, I see more houses going up. So like how did we weather that, and how are we going to weather it better?
Great question. For the sake of the people living there, I hope they're still standing. So the reasons you see something like that kind of tract housing or maybe sort of cookie cutter are many. And certainly since World War II, housing developers are in a financial, so to get financing to build something like that, it's easier to convince your lender, if you're as a bank or someone else, that you're going to make some money because we've done this before and we're going to do it again, and so you can just kind of repeat. And then also the developers who build like that are kind of set up to get good at doing what they do because they're in the for-profit business. So the architects they work with and everything else, the lawyers and the regulatory framework just makes it easier to put something like that on a repeat. I would say, so when we're advising cities, for instance, you know, you don't want to discourage housing investment. You don't want to constrain supply overall, but there are, I would say there are now locally some developers who are finding different housing products are underrepresented. In the suburbs, you know, you certainly see different sizes of homes and rentals and different mix of amenities than we used to see. But you know, there's only so much you can do and only so much you want to do to try and control, you know, housing development that comes your way.
Since I guess one or two size households is one level, have you guys ever tried to encourage roommates or maybe subsidize the creation of duplexes or existing houses?
So the question, correct me if I'm wrong, was because of the rise in 1- and 2-person households, would we recommend other living situations like roommates or duplexes, things like that? So I would say to solve the affordability issue, you know, housing prices rise faster than incomes recently. Yes, there are all sorts of other kind of living accommodations that do make sense. In the recession, we saw intergenerational households as well and things like that.
Yeah, do you guys do anything
To encourage that, I would say a flexible housing stock allows for that. And you know, if someone wants to take on a roommate, I don't know if we as consultants would recommend that a city, you know, would directly encourage that. But you do want to build in flexibility. So, you know, I mean, that's obviously an option. If you lose a job, you take on a roommate, or you know, if you got to take care of an ailing parent, then maybe best if they come live with you. So those kinds of housing options help, you know, individual households. So,
You know, thinking about the building in downtown Indianapolis, that seems very, that doesn't seem varied at all. Okay.
varied.
It does not seem varied. It's
Uh-huh.
tiny apartments for 1 or 2 people, and
Mhm.
that's it.
Mhm.
I mean, isn't that basically what's being built? And very small condos, and, or am I wrong about that?
So the question is, downtown housing seems unvaried, and many of the new units are rather small. Yeah, so because of, I would say, the mismatch between household sizes, so we have a lot of 1- and 2-person households now, certainly compared to 50 years ago. I think it's easier to attract a renter, you know, who's looking for a smaller space. Not only if, you know, there may be a preference to live in a smaller space, but that just is inherently more affordable if there's less square footage to build out and to rent to a person or to heat or maintain. I would say there are a mix of new homes being built downtown. In my neighborhood, some homes are 4,000 square feet. That's pretty big, and I would say some of the developers that are active downtown are just trying to do what they do best, and as long as there's demand to rent and to buy condos and homes, they may keep going. Is it ideal? I think time will tell. Yes?
Are you familiar with Richard Florida's book, The Rise of the Creative Class, which was used by a lot of urban planners, and what he suggested in terms of economic development was the service class, and for me, I guess I would say downtown Detroit now is an example of that. What do you think about that model, and would you encourage Indianapolis to pursue that model or to do something different, and why?
So the question was, am I familiar with Richard Florida's book, The Rise of the Creative Class? And he was promoting kind of service sector jobs. An interesting example is Detroit, of course, a historic manufacturing hub where downtown, some of the recent investment has been in more service sector jobs than manufacturing jobs. That I think is unfortunately out of many cities' control. You know, there are really global economic patterns that are driving, you know, the fall in manufacturing. There were great wages to be made 50 years ago in manufacturing. That's not as much the case. Whereas at least here in Indianapolis, many, but certainly not all of these service sector jobs do pay pretty decent wages. I would argue for a diversified industrial mix for any city. I think Detroit is aiming for that, but some of that just kind of happens naturally. There's certainly something to be said for keeping some domestic manufacturing, and maybe some things aren't best made here, but that will work itself out. And really, each region is different. We have to consider the strengths that we have in the workforce. What's the skill set and experience that our workers have, and try and best to bolster that and build on that, and match that with employers who can provide meaningful and gainful employment to folks. So we have to get moving on. Mark will be here afterwards, and if we have time after our next speaker, we can do a group kind of question and answer session. And so, how many of you read your workbook like you're supposed to? What is Indianapolis' biggest industry in terms of employment? Medical, healthcare. How many of you have turned on the news every month or so for the past year? What's going on in Congress, right? Right, so is healthcare a stable industry? Right, there's so many unknowns about healthcare. Now, what's the number one reason why people live in a neighborhood? Anyone know? Not schools.
Proximity.
Family, friends, proximity. It's what you can afford. People live where they can afford, right? That kind of makes sense. Like, why do planes crash? Gravity, right? So people live where they can afford. And so if we have a lot of high-income workers in the healthcare industry, and that healthcare industry, something happens to that, how does that impact some neighborhoods? Right? Because we have a lot of neighborhoods that are segregated by income, right? You've got low income, you've got middle income, you've got high income neighborhoods. And so we'll revisit this topic. We'll revisit that chart that Mark showed you. That's actually the chart that keeps me up at night. The mismatch between our housing stock and our preferences. And so we'll revisit that in 2 sessions from now when we talk about making Indianapolis competitive. But think about how the economy, the types of people that live in your neighborhood, are they varied? Do they all leave at 8 o'clock and do they all come back at 5? How many of you are near East Siders or near West Siders? Okay, good handful of you. And so your neighborhoods were built around factories, around manufacturing jobs. What happened when those manufacturing jobs left? Empty buildings, neighborhoods struggled, right? It's because those neighborhoods were built for that single purpose of supplying factory workers to the factories. And so think about how the jobs, the economics, what people work, what people make relate to the types of houses, the types of retail, the types of amenities you have in your neighborhood. Is it diverse enough to support a bunch of different types of people, so when one industry falls on hard times, the whole neighborhood doesn't go kind of downhill? And so on that note, Matt's going to look this up. So Matt Wakefield is the Director of Community Engagement for Keep Indianapolis Beautiful.
Thank you very much for having me. As Brad said, I'm Director of Community Engagement at Keep Indianapolis Beautiful. We are the cleaning and greening nonprofit throughout Indianapolis and all of Marion County. I imagine most of you have seen our work, or at least participated in our work, I hope. If not, after this presentation, hopefully you'll be inspired to do it. But I was really excited when Brad actually gave me the topic of social resilience, because about a month ago, my block was put to the test of our social resilience. It was about Saturday night, about 10 o'clock. Probably the average alcoholic drink consumed was probably about 2.5 for everyone on our block. And the power went out. Exactly. So what's the first thing everyone does when the power goes out? First you grab a flashlight, and then you go out and you look at your neighbor's house and see if their power's out. So we get outside and everyone's out there. And so it was at that point that we started talking and figuring out, well, who doesn't have flashlights, who has candles. And then we got to talking about, well, all right, who has a generator in case we're here for a very long time, and what we need to take care of as a group. Then we figured out that we had everything stabilized, everyone was accounted for, and then we took count of how much beer is left. It was a beautiful night, so we were able to sit out on the porch, walk around the neighborhood, have some beers, catch up, in a way that we wouldn't have. I don't know if we as a group would be able to bounce back from anything more major than the power going out, but I can safely say that we were able to take count of everyone in our neighborhood, call the electric company, and sit and wait. It took about 3 hours for the power to come back on, so it wasn't really that big of a deal, but that is really kind of a really microcosm of what your social resiliency is on a block level, and then I'll talk a little bit about extrapolating that out to a neighborhood level, focusing really on the built environment, as well as then a city level, and how Keep Indianapolis Beautiful plays a role in creating those social bonds, creating those ability for you to have social resilience in the groups in which you're acting. So, social resilience. Like we've defined resilience 2 or 3 times now, so just put people in there, the ability for people to bounce back from any sort of adversity as an ecosystem of people. I'm going to talk a little bit about the built environment, how that affects it, and KIB's role in that change. So the 3 pillars, you saw that Venn diagram, it gets really messy, right? Something that's good for the environment is also good for people, and there's different actors in it, so there's going to be a lot of overlap in the things we've talked about, as well as the built environment, and things you probably heard about yesterday at our last time we met as well. But those 3 pillars are the triple bottom line. It sounds really impressive or dignified, but it's really just people, the environment, and the economy, and how they interact with each other. The basis of the social resiliency is that social capital. And that social capital is really the value of the networks. Oh, sorry, this is like the official definition, and it's a little hard to read on the screen. I wonder if I can make it bigger. Look, oh, apparently not. The value of those networks and the norms of reciprocity that arise within those networks, which sounds really scientific and all-encumbering and hard to parse out what that is in the real definition. But what that really is the social networks, that's who you know, right? And then the norms of reciprocity, what you'll do for them and what they'll do for you. That's the breakdown of the social capital that you have, that you as a group have, and extrapolate throughout those things. So this is closely integrated into your well-being, right? So well-being is a number of different things. It's the it's also just like, it's used interchangeably, right? Well-being, quality of life, standard of living, human development, welfare, utility, happiness. It's a big, all-encompassing thing that is kind of what we think of, or generally think of as sort of outside of my control necessarily, but I attribute to it. So what is well-being? How would you define it? It's the basic material for a good life: freedom and choice, health, good social relations, and security. That's like a lot, right? Like, how much do you have control over that? So how do you measure it for sustainable resilience, right? How do you measure well-being? How do you measure happiness? That sounds like something that is, it's a big endeavor, right? Like, I don't think we could poll everyone in the room and ask, like, what is happiness? What attributes to your happiness? And it would be a ton of different things, and then how you measure those things. So for that sake, there's been a few different studies that work on this, that study exactly what happiness is, and then how we can compare happiness across populations, across cultures, across groups, and study kind of the effects of it. So there's been sort of these 10 dimensions of social sustainability, social resilience, that are needed or necessary, that are used to measure. So this is what you measure if you're trying to measure happiness: demographic change, education and skills, employment, health and safety, housing and environmental health, identity, sense of place and culture, participation, empowerment and access, social capital, social mixing and cohesion, and overall quality of life. So within that, you see pretty much all of those elements of that Venn diagram that you're trying to measure, and that's just measuring your social sustainability. So it all kind of starts at the block level. And so you probably saw Kim Irwin's presentation. And so this is essentially from Walk Score, you can guess what this is. This is where you can walk in a mile in 2 different outputs. One being a dense city urban cluster, one being a suburban development, as you might see. The yellow or the purple is residential, is retail, the green being park space, all of those being important to a neighborhood and its cohesion, its economic vitality, and your overall happiness. So what makes a neighborhood walkable? It has a center. Sometimes that's you, most of the times it's like a square or a market, someplace where people gather and congregate. It has people in it. It has a mix of uses, and ideally a mix of incomes, that it's equitable and it's for everyone. Parks and public spaces. It's pedestrian oriented. It has schools and workplaces, and is multimodal in streets. So another thing important to remember is that just because an area is dense and full of people does not mean it's necessarily walkable. I think we've all kind of seen those old style Soviet block towers that are just residential towers that are a mile high and just concrete buildings for as far as you can see. They have sidewalks, they don't have cars, but you wouldn't really consider that a walkable, active, functioning space where the community is in that sort of third place meeting area. So what does it really have to do with you, the built environment, walkability? Why is it important? So walkability, and I'm sure you've talked a lot about this, it fosters better economic outcomes, or better health outcomes. So you are a healthier person living in a more dense, walkable space than you would be otherwise. Generally, you're safer. They have a lower crime rate, more satisfaction with safety, knowing the police. Opportunity to age in place. You can grow old in that space. That is very closely linked to choices in transportation, that not everyone is driving all the time. And it has lower infrastructure costs, meaning that more people can live there, and the collective you is being charged a lot less to sustain that population, meaning there's more money for the things that are important to you, like schools and health and fun. It also has increased commercial and housing values. So these are just sort of the density, the walkability have been correlated to these things. 2 examples that don't look like the maps. Which one's a more walkable space? Which one could you access? Which one is for more people to utilize and live in as those spaces? So this is where we get into the social sciences, right? Like, you could live in the suburbs and feel like you're perfectly happy, right? Like, no one can say you're not happy. Or you could live in a neighborhood that is in the middle of downtown and you can be miserable. So how do you measure how you feel? Like, how do you come to a consensus of how people do that? So people have been trying for a very long time, some with more success than others. So we're going back to these 10 dimensions that everyone's looking at to map and figure out what those are. So a group, that one study I want to point out to you is they usually created a community index survey, and they did this in what are 2,000 households in 2 different cities, mostly like cities, with 10 different neighborhoods, with various built forms. So they didn't define if you live in a walkable neighborhood or not. It was entirely up to you to decide if your neighborhood is walkable. How they decided that was in the survey, they basically asked, how many places can you walk? And they decided that if you decided that you had 7 places in your geographic area that you could walk to, then you were probably in a walkable neighborhood. If you had less than that, if you couldn't name 7 places that you could physically walk, you're probably not in a walkable neighborhood. So then this was done in 2 parts, not only did they do 7 places you could walk, but then they asked, well, are there 7 places that you actually do walk to? How many places do you walk to? So people perceive the walkability of their neighborhood to be much higher than the actual use of that walkability. But within those households, 700 return surveys. That's a 35% return. Anyone who's done surveys knows that's pretty darn good. And there was drastic increases, over a 10% change in the number of people who found differences in whether they trusted people, just at the very base level. It didn't lead you into any considerations, just can you walk, how many places can you walk to, and on this level, how much would you say you trust people versus don't trust people? Do you trust your neighbors versus you don't trust your neighbors? Have you worked on a community project in the last 6 months? And so there was a much higher ratio of people living in places where at least they perceived they could walk, to participating in community, trusting their neighbors, trusting people in general, and being more positive, reporting better health outcomes than if you lived in a non-walkable space, which really gets back to this social net, this safety net, these people who come out at being in neighborhoods that are walkable, and responding to crises, ability to be resilient when there is a chance for that. That these people, by having this higher social capital and live in spaces in which they can act, are now able to then be more socially resilient than those who live in more isolated spaces and generally have a less positive outlook on life, or more or less happier in the situation in which they live. So what's KIB's role in this? What are we doing? Most people know us as just planting trees, or we help you get trash bags and gloves to help clean up trash. Well, we do a lot more than that, and we're pretty sneaky about it too, so even if you don't know, some of you are adopt-a-block captains, you're actually doing a lot of this, creating social net and building community. Hopefully you realize it, but some of you might be doing it without noticing it. So we have Adopt-a-Block and Great Indy Cleanup, creating third places through our community green spaces and school parks, and community tree plantings. I'm just going to go really briefly and talk a little bit about those programs, as well as the what we've measured and actually seen out of those community groups that create this higher social capital just by participating with us in these programs. So Adopt-a-Block, this is where you make that commitment to clean up your block. So this is open to anyone in Marion County. We help you, give you litter grabbers, shovels, trash bags, whatever you need to help clean up your block. And through that, we also give you door hangers. And through these door hangers, you're supposed to introduce yourself to your neighbors, say who you are, and how they can help out. So sometimes they just say, hey, next time you're throwing out stuff, just put it in the trash can, don't throw it in the street, because I have to pick it up. A lot of people report that really actually works. People are like, oh, sorry, I didn't know anyone cared. And then next thing you know, sometimes they're organizing cleanups that they can do as a group, having cookouts, dinners, anything like that. Some people just really want to pick up trash and not talk to anyone. That's their prerogative too. But through this program, we've connected neighbors together. We're building connections amongst community members, neighborhood-wide, city-wide. We have community groups that meet together, share best common practices, meet people from across the city who are experiencing the same issues that they are, experiencing issues the same way, and experiencing the same issues they are. We hope we grow this community into something that's much larger, and we also provide opportunities for them not only to network with people across the city, but network with their neighbors and fellow captains. So if they have a plan to, they want to build a small park, they want to plant flowers, we help give them flowers. We have micro grants to help build that park as well. IPL Project Green Space and Green Kids. This is where we actually transform spaces that are underutilized, creating that third space where community members can identify a space in which they know is underutilized, isn't contributing to the community, and then they can take an active role in caring for that. So it's turning that space into an active community green space, creating community design. So we work with community to design that space and implement it. We don't come in here and say, you need a swing set and 4 oak trees. Good luck. What we do is actually help them design that space in which they want to utilize it. We bring volunteers in to help build it, and then we give them the tools to help maintain it and stewardship over the course of that park's life. So these are just really quick examples. I like showing the pretty pictures of what it looks like when it starts. This is Merrill Street, Fletcher Place, right along the Cultural Trail. This is a great example of a highly used public space with just a grass lot sitting next to it that isn't really contributing to the vibrancy of the neighborhood around it. This is what it looked like at the end of the project. That's what it looks like today. And so we're working with them to help maintain and care for that space over time. Benedict Inn, this is a great story of the Sisters of St. Benedict Inn down in Beech Grove. If you've never been down there, they're amazing. But this used to be, where the spot you're looking at was a parking lot. They tried to grow sod on it. It was varying levels of not working. Next to it was a community center that the sisters could no longer take care of, and that was actually had to be torn down, and they turned that into a parking lot to be closer to their space. But they still wanted it to be a community space, that their only connection to the neighborhood, the only way they got people from the neighborhood to be a part of their actual community was through that community center. But they realized that they can't afford to maintain a 50-year-old pool complex. So what they want to do is create a peace and nature garden. This is what it looks like after it's planted. That's what it looks like today. So it's pathways, art. They designed it, the community came in, they maintained it, helped steward it. And it's turning those spaces into third places that not only, our main interest is also to have native plants, trees, making beautiful green spaces, but it also allows those community members to come together and talk about what their neighborhood could be and how they can do it together. And then finally, I would be remiss for this if I didn't talk about IPS 91. This is a much more inclusive community. This is a school, School 91. They had an atrium that was essentially just a mosquito pit. It was a dank pit full of mosquitoes, like quite literally. You could just see them everywhere you went. As it was closed in by 4 walls and no one knew what to do with it. We came in, we worked with Marion County Health and Hospital to help stabilize the space, get rid of the mosquitoes, and the kids wanted to use it as a, and this is mostly their idea, I assume their teachers were prodding them as well, but they wanted to use it as a quiet space, a counseling space. So they're dealing with a lot of times kids are having fits, syndromes, disruptions in the class. And it was a space that they could go, and it would just be a place that they could go one-on-one counseling and exude some of that energy within that space. So it was actually designed and built by the kids along with some parent supervision. And this is still in progress, but this is it today in their celebration of called Picnic with the Parents that they had and started. So all their parents are there helping, celebrating that space as well. And their next big goal is for the kids to actually do outreach within the school, letting every teacher and kid know that they're welcome to use that space. So it's available to everyone and not just part of the Green Kids Club. And then finally, I want to talk about our community tree plantings. I'll be really quick because I feel like everyone's about ready to get out of here. We found what we know we're really good at, because we do over 2,000 trees every year, is we can put trees in the ground. We're really good at that. We can water trees, we can mulch trees. But we found, incidentally, through some of our studies working with IU School of Forestry and SPIA, is that actually a higher percentage of trees survive at a higher rate if the community plants them and waters them together than if volunteers, we come and plant them and water them, and we water them on a schedule. That community groups that do it together have a higher survivability over 5 years than if we come out and do it, or if we hire contractors to come out and do it. So it really is the community being there, being present, actually both benefits the environment and it benefits the community because it's an act that they're doing together. One group has taken this one step further in that not only, so they're not just planting it together, but the tree that you plant is not your tree. You have to plant your neighbor's tree. So you're responsible for your neighbor's tree and what happens on it as someone, the next person is responsible for your tree. That has not only, has the obvious implications of that if I planted a tree in my neighbor's yard, I would be really concerned and want to make sure that it did not die. But it also has fostered so many more interactions and relations within that community that would not have existed if they just had people come in, hire a contractor, and put a tree in their front yard. This is beyond the benefits of just everything that hopefully that tree will do for the environment, but hopefully it's building a stronger community as well.
Creating social resilience.
Exactly. Thank you.
Right, I lost mine.
Everyone hear me? Yeah. All right, so give me some examples of where you hang out with your neighbors in your neighborhood. Front porch.
Back porch.
Back porch. Backyard deck.
Walking the dog.
Walking the dogs. You run into neighbors on the way. So riding a bike, Black Acre Brewery, so those third places.
Block parties.
Block parties, so the street itself can be a gathering place, right? What was that? Indie convergence, so festivals and events and things like that, right? So the key thing to understand is it's important for neighbors to come together, to build places where neighbors can come together before crises happen. You see? All right. So it's important to build places where people can come together before crises happen, right? Too often in planning, I find that two things trigger neighbors to come together. You want to guess what they are? Crime, right? So it's a tragedy. So crime. Something happens and all of a sudden it's a crisis. We got to get together and work together. What's the other thing? It's some zoning case. It's usually a gas station. Right? How many of you have battled a gas station, right? Gas stations and murders are the things that bring neighborhoods together, and that's sad. Right? That's awful. And so things like front porches, things like parks, things like events bring neighbors together to plant trees to beautify their neighborhood. Places like that we have to bring neighbors together. So Jess, we do not have an activity for you tonight, and some of you are probably excited about that. But Jess does have some homework for you.
See, Brad lied just now because I'm actually going to give you a week-long activity. Just multiply it. So what I want you guys to do is I want you to all to go home, walk around your neighborhood, and do an audit of your neighborhood's resiliency. And I want you to take pictures of things, whether they're contributing to the resiliency or detracting from it. And I want you to hashtag that on social media, right? With People's Planning Academy, and then either resilient or not resilient, right? So say you're walking down the street and you see your neighborhood has planted their yard with native plants. Hashtag resilient, right? Or say you find a whole area that's built in 1960s strip commercial. Probably not very resilient. Raise your hand if you, like Matt, have had a beer with your neighbor on your front porch. Hashtag resilient. How many people in this room have that neighbor that like maybe grunts at you when you say hi and never makes eye contact? Raise your hand. Right? Hashtag not resilient. So I want you all to, so you get the idea, walk around your neighborhood, try to document these things, and get thinking about your environmental, social, and economic resilience of your neighborhood, and just start thinking about that. If you don't use social media, that's totally okay. Take a picture anyways, print it out, take notes, draw a picture. I would love it if everyone came here next week with a picture of your neighborhood's resiliency. And then bring them all in and post them on social media. We'll talk about them next Thursday. Sound good? All right. Brad, do you have? Oh, and there's more homework. I'm sorry. This isn't me. This one's Brad. Just to read the resiliency chapter in your workbook if you haven't done that already. Also, I wanted to point out that the pattern book public review has been extended for another 2 weeks. I think we might have given you the wrong URL last time, so it said .com at the end. It's actually .org. So indy.civiccomment.org. It's a little tricky. There's only one C in the middle, so be cognizant of that. And if you could all go and provide, any comments that you can provide on that will make that a better document. So I really encourage you to take the time to do that.
All right, so if Allyson and Mark come up here, does anyone have any questions for any of the speakers tonight?
Can you go back a slide?
Go back a slide. Serious student here. All right, we've got a few minutes for questions. Sir?
Yes, I guess whenever you mentioned that, or whenever you mentioned the effects of climate change, I guess compared to our neighbors like Ohio or Kentucky, do you think, and just given that there's been this area, civil war was also partly aggravated by climate change, do you think it would be a source or be a refugees from other states or other countries?
Oh, that's a good question. The question was, when we compare Indiana to our neighboring states in the Midwest, will we export refugees or import them? Is that essentially? That's a good question. I think that Indiana has, I mean, it's hard to really predict the future, but from what I can see of Indiana and how they're responding, we are in a good position to receive refugees from a physical standpoint. From a social capital standpoint, will be interesting to see how that would play out. I think economically, I would probably defer to Matthew on this. Or, I'm sorry. If you guys want to have any comments on that, but I think from a physical, environmental standpoint, I think we would be well positioned because of our agricultural base, and because just climatically, I think there's going to be, from a food production standpoint, we'll have ability to diversify crops, which would mean from a basic food standpoint, we could probably sustain more people.
Echo that.
All right, any other questions? Sir, back in the corner here.
Well, we heard a question earlier about the whole cornfield turning into a huge subdivision that's all residential and how that's supposed to make an impact later on. And then, like Matthew, you mentioned kind of microgrants to empower smaller groups of community people to be more involved in the local, green spaces and your base. Are we seeing any kind of a trend, like on macro level, like is the city considering, instead of bidding for these like Amazon headquarters to focus on smaller funding opportunities to help, the near east side, the west side we talked about, sort of tons of empty buildings could be a great site for development, but not, there's not going to be a Walmart there, there's not going to be some huge one developer comes in. So we consider like kind of focusing on micro development.
Yes, and so it's a both and, right? We are going after Amazon. We go after big companies all the time, but most of our jobs come from companies that grow, from small businesses that grow here. That takes a lot more work. We call it economic gardening, because it takes a lot more work to manage, trying to grow 100 companies, one person at a time, than to bring in a massive Amazon. You got 50,000, like that. But that certainly is part of the strategy of Develop Indy. That's part of our economic development strategy for the city. As far as the vacant buildings, the vacant property, we're a little behind other cities on industrial reuse. That's something that we're really ramping up. Our nonprofit land bank partner, Renew Indianapolis, is getting into the commercial and industrial business now. My department, DMD, is the real estate redevelopment arm of the city. And we've purchased the PR Mallory complex on the east side. We've purchased the RCA Sherman Park property on the near east side. And then obviously we've been heavily involved in the GM stamping plant reuse project, which is pretty exciting. And so we're starting to get into that. All right, let's go up here and then I'll come back there.
In your gardening of small businesses, have you thought about putting flex spaces for small business owners to come and be able to use to work, office space, meeting space, things like that, create space for them to utilize?
Yeah, so the question was about flex space, and as we do economic gardening, is that a kind of a strategy? And that certainly is something that's taken off. There's several co-working spaces that have popped up across the county, some of them downtown. There's a couple in Broad Ripple, right? Fletcher Place has one. So that is certainly a piece of the strategy. A decade or two ago, we called those business incubators, and they were kind of formal structures, but I think that is something that's the marketplace has figured out. That there's a demand for. We've worked a lot on an industrial kind of makerspace with Ruckus in the Circle City Industrial Complex. And so that's a way for people that have skilled crafts, makers who make stuff still, to have access to a bunch of expensive equipment and tools that they can't otherwise afford, but that's how they can start growing their company. And so that is a piece of the strategy. All right, woman back here?
Yes. I think my question is possibly for you. Apartment stock.
development on Canal. TWG was the developer on that project. Also the project on Michigan and Capitol. I don't know who that developer is, but that type of housing, those type of units, that size unit, is that going to continue? Do you have any limitations on that size development? Do we see more of that coming downtown?
So the question was the size of apartments and development that we're building downtown. So, you know, Mark showed the household size diagram. And when we get to the competitive class, I'll revisit this some. But we build product for today's demand, right? But who sets property values? It's tomorrow's demand, right? It's how in demand that product is tomorrow. And so we spend a lot of time, if you're a homeowner, you spend a lot of time trying to protect your property values, but it's not you protecting them, it's making sure that someone wants that product. And so we have to think forward about what does the future going to demand, and that's hard to do, right? And so that's why Mark said it's best to have some of everything, and so you don't miss, right? It's like if you invest in stocks, you don't want everything in one industry. You want to diversify your retirement portfolio, and so the same thing with housing. And so, am I concerned that we've got lots of 1 and 2 bedroom or studio apartments downtown? Yeah. As government, there's not a whole lot we can do about that. That's what the demand is for. That's what people want today. Now, down the road, 10, 20 years from now, if demographics somehow change, right, then it's going to be a challenge for us. All right, sir here?
Well, Indianapolis still has thousands of vacant houses that are potentially livable. What are we going to do about facilitating those being cycled into use?
So vacant housing is a class unto itself. It's extremely complex, more complex than it probably needs to be. Short answer is Mayor Hogsett has committed to addressing 2,000 of those in the coming years, whether that's demolishing or getting them back into productive use. We have a land bank. I mentioned Renew Indianapolis, they're our partners, and so my department has the ability to grab property out of surplus, which is the final stage where properties go to die at the treasurer's office. We can grab those out and then get them back on the productive tax rolls. We also have some federal community development dollars that can then help get working with neighborhood partners to get some new things built, whether it's a park or a new home. So the short answer is properties, there's lots of reasons properties become vacant, but when we have chronically vacant places in town, that's a market failure, right? There's a reason no one wants those houses. And there can be lots of reasons for that. But until we address that underlying reason, we're only going to be able to deal with it one house at a time. So there is no easy answer to vacant housing. It's something that we're passionate about working on. That's something that Mayor Hogsett has made pretty clear to everyone working in the building, that abandoned housing is one of our biggest issues. And so my role in that is trying to rebuild neighborhoods that are competitive so people want to buy those houses, want to come back, and they don't have to go through us. We're kind of the owner of last resort. All right, final comments or questions? We're a little over time.
Just a question about some of the housing areas that are being rebuilt and really nice, but the prices are too high for people to live there. You know, so how are we balancing out our gentrification moves around Indianapolis, particularly around the downtown area?
So that is a fantastic segue to next week, because next week we'll be talking about how we build an inclusive community, and we will have a speaker talking about displacement. Now, I will say that displacement, gentrification, whatever you want to call it, gets a lot of press, and it's certainly a serious issue in some neighborhoods. We've had the Center for Community Progress, which is a nonprofit that advises cities based out of Flint, Michigan, come in, and they've actually done studies about where we might have gentrification happening. There's about 5 census tracts in town where it's likely could be happening. That represents about 2% of our population. So 2% of our population is subject to gentrification type of effects. More than 1/3 of our population are subject to the opposite of gentrification. And so we're losing people and we're losing values. And so from a public policy perspective, we've got 30% of our people that are losing their equity, right? They're losing the stabilizing force in the American dream. And so that doesn't get any of the attention, but that is a huge issue in some of our neighborhoods. Certainly gentrification is around the downtown ring neighborhoods. And we will talk about that next time. The state has not exactly made it easy to do some of these things. There's been some legislation passed that have taken some tools away, but we still do have a lot of tools that we can deploy. And so we'll talk some about displacement next week. And so we'll also talk about building neighborhoods for all incomes and all ages, and so you can age in place. We'll talk about displacement. And then I'll be back, I apologize, but I'll be back talking about the dark side of city planning and how city planning has created the patterns that we see in our map, or in our geography today. And so that is very important to me personally, because if you don't understand history, you're bound to repeat it, right? And so those will be our topics next Thursday. And I hope you guys have a safe drive home, safe ride home, and we'll see you in a week.